I'm actually going to go first, if you don't mind, and then Zama will go second. But good morning, comrades. Thanks for coming out this morning. I know Sunday morning, or at least over here it's Sunday morning. So I'm going to open up this panel with a discussion of, with a very humble attempt at trying to encapsulate an analysis of global capitalism in about 20 minutes. We'll see how that goes. But I want to try to use this opportunity to frame this analysis, as a way to sort of put forth the urgency of building revolutionary socialist organizations around the world. But for us here in the heart of global imperialism, the urgency is especially knocking at our door. So let me start by I'm really going to talk about some broad trajectories of capitalism, and hopefully in the discussion we can get down more into a lot of the detail of what I'm going to talk about. But I want to start by emphasizing capitalism as a totality of features of a global political economy, and I'm going to talk about it through that context. With the foundational understanding that global capitalism operates through the international circulation, implantation, and concentration of capital within and across borders. And this is structured on a multi-layered, exploitation of labor, again, at all levels, and managed by capitalist states. And capitalist states advance the interests of capital over labor in all social relations, historically penetrating first through force, then through law, and finally through culture. It also operates through imperialist relations. For a brief summary of that is operating as alliances of international capital in national capital, essentially seeking to extract wealth from within their own nations, but collectively from subject nations. And ultimately, imperialism has created scales of control, political domination, extraction, and wealth transfer that I would argue, in 2022 has reintroduced, by 2022 I should say, has reintroduced forms of neo-colonization. And within this imperial system are rivalries. Inter-imperialist conflicts lead to competition and then potentially war, as we see around in the world around us today. But also just embedded competition as rival hierarchical blocks vie for influence, power, and control with internationally linked capitalist markets. And it also leads to inter-imperialism, as I mentioned. So imperialism and inter-imperial conflict go hand in hand. I also want to emphasize that I believe we're seeing the manifestation of a lot of underlying contradictions and fracturing of the U.S.-led capitalist order. And this is a major factor to understand why we're experiencing forms of destabilization on a global scale, and why we emphasize this conference being called Communist Refoundation in an Era of Crisis. And the crises that we're in right now, from an economic standpoint, are part of a series of economic crises that capitalism has underwent. Start in the early 90s, in the late 90s and early 2000s, between 2008 and 10, 2020, and now, now it appears that we're heading into another recession in 2022. And this destabilization, these embedded crises have been accompanied by military invasion, military intervention, coup, and war. All of these features, since the end of the last Cold War, the last major setup of inter-imperialist rivalries. And over this last period, especially since the 90s, we've seen the forced opening and subjugation of whole economies. And as I mentioned, neo-colonialism through the plunder of what are referred to as free trade agreements. We've seen the multipolar differentiation of regional powers divisions and reorganization of international economic and military alliances, and now increasing inter-imperialist tensions. And if history is a guide, these have the potential to escalate into larger wars. So what's happening in Europe right now, for instance. And simultaneously and in conjunction with this series of crises, we've seen revolutionary uprisings, revolts, class struggle movements, increasingly militant protests growing in scale and size, and widening social polarization and radicalization happening internationally. And I would say that this helps us understand, or should help us understand, the loosening of the ideological glue of capitalism that has held the class structures, much of the global class structure intact, especially, in the heart of empire. But the loosening of this glue across the world, including in the United States. In the heart of empire, there's urgent need for rebuilding revolutionary organizations that can play a role in organizing and building class power, and also directing it as self-interested, in the self-interest of the working class, against the vagaries of a violent and decaying system. So let me talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of capitalism on a global scale today. And I call this class war, wealth transfer and concentration on a world historic scale. The last 30 years plus can be understood as capitalism undergoing qualitative shifts to an increasingly internationally integrated system through imperialism, as I previously mentioned. International mobility of capital and an exponential scale of financialization, the opening up of economies to speculative capital, to multinational capital, et cetera. And the hierarchical integration of finance capital, primarily through banking, but in other ways, over a larger share of the forces of production. And we see this right now, especially in the last few years, I should say, playing out through consolidation of capital and concentration of capital on an unprecedented scale. We see it through national and international buyouts and mergers, in which smaller sort of quantities of capitalists are accumulating much larger and larger shares of the global economy. We see it accomplished through the implementation of over 354 quote unquote free trade agreements, which are routed through the US-centric World Trade Organization, which has, largely governed, how capitalism has operated for many years now, but especially under this kind of framework of facilitating capital mobility and concentration, i.e., again, class war on an international scale. And we've seen, the way that this is operating has created a kind of international hierarchy of nations in which, capitalists and a small set of nations control large scales of capital and, all that comes with that, across borders. In this last 3 decades, we've seen the destruction, weakening, or decline of alternative economic models of capitalist development, especially state capitalism, kind of nationalist developmentalism, but also I would argue the social democratic model. We've seen the greatest transfer of wealth, in this period in history, that has reflected both within nations, neoliberal capitalist redistribution of wealth from the working class to the rich within the richest nations, and neocolonialism, neoliberalism across borders, transferring wealth from poorer nations to rich nations through the means that I've already discussed. And specifically in the last 3 recessions, the 2008 to 10 recession, the 2020 recession, and what I would argue is now a recessionary moment, a significant facet of this acceleration of global inequality within and across borders has produced debt crises that are rapidly weakening the links the system, especially in the poor nations or former colonized countries. Multinational investment banks, multinational corporations, other types of private investment funds, all kinds of instruments that have been created in the last few decades have bought up large shares of the economy, again, within and across into formerly colonized or poor countries. The U.S.-Mexico model illustrates this, I think, as a kind of model of what's happening internationally. Mexico, U.S. Finance capital controls about 80% of all financial and markets and banking systems in Mexico. Finance capital, in partnership with Mexican capital, has bought up majority shares across industries, manufacturing, like the maquiladora sector, automotive production, mining, agriculture, etc. And so to varying degrees, we've seen this happen internationally, but this model of North America, I think, really defines the trajectory.
10 minutes.
Thank you. One feature of the current economic crisis that we see just in the last year or two is capital escaping stagnating markets to find new ways of making money internationally. So just in the last year, foreign direct investment from rich countries, primarily the U.S., has increased 88% just since 2020. $1.85 trillion crisscrossing the globe, especially from the richest 20 countries to the rest of the world. And we've seen a dramatic increase in what are referred to as mergers and acquisitions as finance capital buys up more of the economy nationally and internationally. And I'm going to skip over some of those details just to move on. So for instance, by 2021, what are referred to as private equity firms like BlackRock, these concentrations of finance, these big concentrations of finance capital, the biggest several private equity firms in the United States now manage $7.3 trillion in assets. That is massive. If you looked at that on an international scale, what the private equity firms based in the U.S. manage would be the fourth largest GDP in the world after U.S., China, and now the third biggest is actually the 5 richest tech firms, which collectively control 10.3 trillion, or worth $10.3 trillion. So these combinations of capital are moving into the third and fourth largest clusters of wealth in the world. And not only that, but profits have increased dramatically for all other forms of capital, including multinational corporations. So the S&P 500 saw their profits increase by 70% since 2020 and 33% since 2019. And they're making, just since 2021, there's been an additional $200 billion made by multinational corporations because of inflationary costs and other factors that have pushed the prices up internationally for the products that they sell, or what they're invested in, but wages haven't. So it's we see how even in crisis these companies make huge money. Okay, moving right along here. So debt is a major aspect of how capital is capital accumulation now. Global debt by 2021 had risen to $303 trillion. That's the largest amount of global debt in history. And just in 2022, another 71 trillion has been added. Current debt levels internationally amount to over 256% of global GDP, the highest in history. So a lot of this system is being, a lot of the maintenance of this system is being stacked up with more and more debt. It's creating fractures in the capacity, especially for foreign nations, to even maintain their debt payments. So between the recession of 2020 and today, more than 100 countries have requested emergency financing from the IMF due to economic crisis and inability to pay their bills. And the IMF has actually grown. The IMF, to be clear, is pulled finance capital from the richest countries that is used to bail out and restructure the economies of other parts of the world. But primarily, it's a major it's a process point for finance capital to have access now to being lent to government, being lent, in all these different ways. So now IMF is pulling, right now in 2022, has announced that it's pulling up to $1 trillion, the highest it's ever raised to be invested in the next few years. And again, keep in mind that this is to financialize more and more, of the global economy and to extract more and more debt servicing from poor nations. Already in 2021, debt from the poorest nations represented 171% of all spending on healthcare, education, and other social protections combined. So in other words, poor countries are spending twice as much money to pay to service the debts they have than they're actually paying on meeting the needs of their own population. And already in 2022, debt servicing from the poorest countries has just the servicing, just the interest on the debts held has amounted to $43 billion. And for the poorest countries, that's equivalent to nearly half of all of their food imports and the total spending on healthcare combined. So debt distress is increasing. Right now in 2022, it's estimated that over 60% of the total countries of the world, 60% of the 195 countries are experiencing some kind of debt distress. Okay.
15 minutes.
Okay. Even in the US, we see debt has increased dramatically since 2007. Debt held by the public in the United States, public debt is now equivalent to 100% of the GDP of the United States. The debt is largely the result of bailouts, not by investing in the social needs of the population. And for social inequality, the majority of the population, the vast majority of working class people have increasingly turned to borrowing to sustain basically their lives. Total consumer debt balance has increased by 5% from 20 to 2021, which was a total of $15 trillion, a $772 billion increase in that 1 year alone in personal debt. And it's already increased 2.7% this year. I don't want to overwhelm with statistics, but just to really emphasize how social inequality is, there's a predatory process in which social inequality, widening social inequality is being financed by increasing amounts of debt, which raises the profit margin through debt financing that we all experience to finance capital in this country. Okay, and I haven't got quite as far as I wanted to, so let me jump ahead to move to my last part. I did want to point out that a new billionaire has been minted on average every 30 hours in the world since March 2020. A new billionaire every 30 hours. There are 2,668 billionaires in the world, 573 more than in the beginning of 2020. So let me talk a little bit about the current crisis. I really didn't get very far. Okay, let me take a few more minutes to go through some final aspects that I'll touch on for this part. Most bourgeois economists believe we are entering into a recession. All of the major capitalist blocs, the US, Japan, EU, China, are experiencing low, slowing, or declining rates of growth. Central bankers around the world are passing interest rate increases. There's been over 60 interest rate increases through central banks to try to basically slow down what has basically been an economic feeding frenzy over the last several years, with the massive state bailouts from state governments to the capitalist classes, and then them using that money to reinvest and make profit in all kinds of other ways, which has led to the inflation of asset prices, the creation of bubbles, and even debt bubbles. Global growth is projected to slow from an estimated 6.1% in 2021 to 3.6%. So global growth is going to go basically cut in half in the next year, and we're going to see a lot of, especially poor countries, being thrown into serious crisis. Sri Lanka, for instance, one of the weaker links in the global debt chain, basically is in a state of insolvency right now, and social, there's been social unrest, serious crisis that we're going to see happening in other countries. Okay, I didn't get through a whole lot of this, so let me just conclude by talking about, on the one hand, we've seen massive class war from the top. On the other hand, we've seen that this one-sided class war has not gone unchallenged. Austerity prices tied to debt servicing and restructuring before the pandemic and current recession had already been devastating working class, poor, and indigenous peoples. If you remember in 2011, if you were around, austerity-induced food shortages and rising prices at that time, amid constricted export markets, contributed to the revolutionary uprisings of the Arab Spring. Austerity-driven protests and unrest then spread to Europe and the United States. The Occupy movement, the movement of the squares, the uprisings, of the Black Lives Matter movement. I would argue, reflecting U.S. characteristics, I should say, of the racial class oppressive system in this country, reflecting the rebellion, reflecting these, not just the anti-oppression aspects of capitalism, but also the class, the widening social divides and polarization expressed through those struggles. We're now seeing rapidly rising prices in international food stocks again being disrupted, leading again to food emergencies and crises across the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. And this has been exacerbated by the conditions of capital concentration internationally, where across international industries, fewer and fewer companies control the supply chain. And as I was going to explain previously, and I'll just say in a few words here, the supply chain disruption represents the sort of path that capital has been able to reorganize production across boundaries, chasing the cheapest labor across the world, and then concentrating control over those supply chains into fewer and fewer corporations. Those supply chains, when we talk about supply chains, it's really very oppressed workers, from hundreds of millions of child labor, tens of millions of forced labor, 7 out of 10 workers of the world living on less than $10 a day. That's the supply chain that's being disrupted. It's not some neat assembly line that just zigzags. It's actually the levels of worker repression and oppression internationally that's being affected by world events. We've seen, and I'll conclude with this point, we've seen revolts take place again after the pandemic. So since 2020 to 2021, there's been another wave of revolt against neoliberal capitalism and austerity, especially in low, poor and former colonized countries, including Lebanon, Ecuador, Chile, Iraq, Puerto Rico, Hong Kong, and many more. A major index based from a United Kingdom research institute that tracks protests and revolts across the world. That's their specialty, is to sort of like study where class struggle is more likely to happen next. In 2020, predicted that up to 40% of the world, nearly half of the world's countries, will experience social unrest or revolt of some kind by 2022, is what they predicted. I think the pandemic sort of slowed that process a little bit, but also since the pandemic, there's been this massive widening of further social inequality, of further smash and grab capitalism. And so I think, the conditions are such that the destabilization we're gonna see revolt happening, more and more in the coming years. And so our political orientation must be towards organizing the class struggle. It must towards creating organizations that can immerse and help build towards revolutionary resolution to these mounting and deadly contradictions of a system in terminal crisis.
Muted myself after you unmuted me. Thanks Justin for the invite and for the broad overview of our fucked up system in crisis. From my perspective, so I'm a worker at Amazon in Chicago. Have been for the past 5 years. I have been organizing for those past 5 years. What I see is that this crisis, capitalism, has definitely affected and pissed off a lot of workers, and as we would expect, fueled an increase in working class struggle. I saw that there was a decrease in fear, at the beginning of the pandemic in particular, due to the decent unemployment benefits that began to be offered, and the widespread availability of jobs. I just remember going everywhere I would go, I see help wanted signs, hiring signs, employers advertising their starting pay, sign-on bonuses. Really felt like a workers' market where employers were competing amongst themselves to attract us to their job. And I think that this created conditions where workers could like honestly say, I don't give a fuck about this job, be more willing to speak their minds, stand up to their boss, quit, engage in collective action, like walkouts, strikes, and unionization efforts. I think, I remember seeing in particular a lot of workers like quitting and effectively shutting down shitty, low-paying workplaces, like dollar stores and fast food restaurants and stuff like that. So I think that this like, I guess like individualized a form of resistance, such as like quitting, is good because, you know, it created like a more widespread sense of like, fuck the boss, fuck this job, etc. But I think more interesting to us is the organized resistance, where workers like organize themselves, take collective action and stay organized. And I think that this activity also increased. I didn't like look into you know, like statistics and stuff like this, but I'm just speaking from, I guess, from what I saw around me. But just our own example, you know, like beginning the pandemic 2020, prior to this, we had not organized any walkouts, strikes, etc. Beginning with the pandemic, you know, we organized 4 shift-long safety strikes. We had engaged in collective action before, but had never organized a walkout or a strike. And the next thing you know, we organized 4 in a week. Soon after that, Amazon closed our site down, and our site, that's where we founded Amazonians United. And they spread us out to 3 new facilities that they had built up. You know, during this time period, Amazon grew tremendously. They were opening up, I think, like 200 new facilities that year, something like that. But anyways, you know, they closed it down, spread us out. And within half a year, talking April 2021, my coworkers at one of those new facilities organized a walkout, demanding shift accommodations to our shitty overnight shift, transportation solutions, and an increased night shift differential. We won that increased night shift differential, came out to basically being like $1 extra. Then was like 8 months, I think within 8 months in December, we organized our first coordinated walkouts in the city of Chicago. So this time, 2 sites walked out a couple days before Christmas, demanding, among other things, higher pay. And within a month of that walkout, we won that pay increase as well. So we won that in late January. Interesting to me, at least, is that many of those coworkers that were the most pissed and were the most gung-ho, were the most militant, were my coworkers that were temporary, that were white badges. And then since then, you know, 5 months, basically a time period of 5 months, my coworkers at the other Chicagoland sites have organized 3 more walkouts, demanding safe staffing levels, and most lately that Amazon on fire coworker who's a member and leader of Amazonians United. I'm just saying all this to show, like, basically the level of struggle that is possible, I think, definitely increased over these past like 2 years. And I think that the crises definitely contributed to this possibility, and to the increase in collective actions and victories. But I think what's key, what's important, is that we had already organized ourselves. We stuck through Amazon shutting our initial base down and spreading us out. And when we got to the new workplace, we started organizing there as well. By spreading us out, Amazon helped us grow from a single site union to a multi-site union. And we're on our way to becoming a citywide union. And I think that our organization, our politics, and our leadership in the workplace were key. What about elsewhere within the past year? I think the most prominent examples are worker activity at Amazon and at Starbucks. So while we've been focusing on independent self-organizing and making direct demands by engaging in collective action at the workplace, most of the public and left's attention has been on union elections at Amazon, organized by RWDSU and Amazon Labor Union. Now the RWDSU, these are the folks that initiated that the organizing campaign in Alabama of Amazon at a fulfillment center. Now they're a standard business union, and predictably they lost both of their attempts to form a union. I think the ALU, more interestingly and surprising, won one election. This happened recently, sparked a wave of triumphalism, and then they lost the other election. People called these NLRB election efforts historic. ALU's victory a game changer. Even saw it was the biggest and best thing to happen to the labor movement since the 1930s. I think that it is interesting that ALU won their union election because it was a very large bargaining unit that is significant. And it was an independent worker effort from the bottom up, led by Chris Smalls, who is a fired supervisor at Amazon, and also led by current workers and some leftists who took the job at Amazon to join the effort of forming a union at JFK 8 in Staten Island. From my perspective, the problem is that they took that worker anger that has grown due to these crises that we've been facing and funneled it into an NLRB election. I think the other high-profile side of worker resistance is at Starbucks. I think Starbucks is a little less interesting than Amazon because it's not really a strategic workplace to organize in terms of each location's small size and their limited disruptive capacity. But I think that it shows the potential of this, downwardly mobile, college-educated youth in moving class struggle forward. Unfortunately, the effort is being led by Workers United, which is a business union, and this struggle is also being funneled into union elections. But my hope is that the Starbucks workers learn firsthand why business unions are incapable of leading the working class struggle, learn from their experience, and grow from it. If not at Starbucks, perhaps at the next workplace that they find themselves in. I've said a couple times, it's unfortunate that they funneled it into NLRB elections. Why do I say this? Basically because I think NLRB elections are a trap. I think that they funnel worker anger and class struggle into bureaucratic processes whose goal is to avoid disruptions to the free flow of commerce and maintain labor peace, basically keeping workers disempowered and subdued and distracted from actually engaging in class warfare on the shop floor, where workers have the highest ability to actually fight, where coworkers are actually familiar, where workers are actually familiar with the terrain, rather than looking to professionals, lawyers, the government, etc., for assistance.
10 minutes.
So I think that, especially considering the current inflation that we're in and the coming recession, I think that working class anger will surely increase And I think that this time, considering that the goal of the Fed is to increase unemployment. They don't want the labor markets to be as tight as they've been. They don't want workers to be able to switch around. They don't want they want for wages to stay level or decrease. I think that workers aren't going to have the same escape valve as they did for the past year or two. And that escape valve being that workers can just quit and find another job. I think that now workers are going to feel more stuck, and that anger is going to build in each workplace, and probably that the workforce at each location will be more stable. And so that creates possibilities for more, just the creation of more networks of people knowing each other, trusting each other, more possibility for forming more like stable organization. And so I think that there is a potential for reaching a higher level of class struggle, like a class struggle that won't just be captured by business unions, that won't just be funneled into union elections, that won't be aimed towards securing labor peace or whatever. But I think that like what will determine whether we reach that potential for a higher level of class struggle is if basically if revolutionaries can get their shit together. Basically if we can form organizations that have that form a decent critical analysis of the labor movement as it exists and as it has existed since the 1930s, and basically that that folks stop getting all excited over nothing. I think that we've rather than go along with empty triumphalism, we've got to be critical of what's going on, so that we're not just repeating the same mistakes that we've been repeating for the past 90 years or whatever. And I think that we've got to learn from the failures of this labor movement, which has constrained itself to operating within the legal framework of labor relations. Basically, I think we've got to figure out how we break with business unionism and how to form new types of unions. Unions that we, together with our coworkers, build in the workplace for the purpose of engaging in class war. Now, I don't say all this, with a disregard for existing union members, and I think that it's very important that those existing union members, also organize at the shop floor level, and engage in class struggle, and transform their unions. But I think that we need to be focusing on organizing folks that haven't yet been organized, that don't have a union, but organizing in the workplace, not with the goal of forming yet another business union, not with the goal of simply entering into that legal framework of labor relations, but with the goal of basically class warfare, basically forming organization of workers at the workplace that formulates their own demands and takes collective action to win those demands. And in the process of engaging in this class struggle, you know, us from our, you know, hopefully the communist, socialist, revolutionary organizations can see which workers rise as the most advanced, the strongest, you know, those that start becoming more, I guess, more conscious, and we're ready to, basically, we're ready to provide them with some sort of political education, basically, so that we can form a new layer of working class communists that you know, can join our organizations, or simply spread the class struggle, you know, in the different workplaces where we're at. And yeah, I think I'll just stop there, and I always like conversation better.